Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at UCF. Our guest today is Professor Tim Cullen, who is the Director of the Oxford Program on Negotiation at Oxford University in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Professor Cullen. How are you today?
Thank you, John. Nice to be here.
Pleasure to have you with us. Tell us a little bit about the Oxford Program on Negotiation and specifically the workshop that we're offering in the Central Florida area now.
Well, the program we have in Oxford is a 5-day program, and we bring in faculty from pretty much all over the world to help us teach it. And I teach 2 half-day sections in it, and I direct the program. And I founded the program about 7 years ago. It's a 5-day program, executive program. It has a mix of about 50% public sector, 50% private sector participants who come and join the program. But what we're doing here in Orlando at UCF is a 2-day version of it. I'm doing it on my own. I'm teaching on my own, teaching cases. Most of the cases I'm teaching ones that are role plays that I've written myself. They're going to take the participants pretty much out of their normal environment, and they're going to negotiate some things that they're not likely to do in their normal lives. But the message from that is that there's no difference in negotiation, whether you're negotiating a merger and acquisition, or whether you're negotiating how late your daughter can stay out in the evening, or you're negotiating between North Korea and its neighbors. So the same principles apply.
Well, let's talk about how this workshop came to be offered at UCF. We were discussing this as a concept some years ago during a UCF-led mission to the UK, and you were one of our hosts. And the idea was sort of tossed around at that point.
Well, that's right. And I mean, I've known you for, I don't know, more than 20 years. And I've sort of seen what's been developing here at UCF in terms of the Global Perspectives program and the dialogue on global issues. And when your group was in Oxford, it struck us that, this would be something that, with the Executive Development Center downtown, as a slightly different offering than is typically there, that we could sort of produce a program that would be relevant for people here. But as we got into it, I realized that if I was to try to build simulations and role plays about how to sell oranges, or whatever it happens to be. I know that people do a lot more things than sell oranges in Orlando nowadays, but when I first came to Florida in the 1960s, the economy was much less diversified than it is now. And but we decided that actually having people play roles that are really quite unusual works quite well. And so, for instance, in one of the role plays, people will participate in a role play where they're trying to purchase pheasant eggs, the eggs of pheasants. All these different participants need this 100,000 or so pheasant eggs for different purposes, and a broker is trying to sell them. We do another negotiation which is between the head of the financial side of a government, of a small government, negotiating with the head of the chief civil servant in the education side about whether their budget will increase or not. And the grand finale is a quite exciting negotiation, which is a multi-party, multi-issue negotiation, which is between a pharmaceutical company trying to introduce a new nutrition supplement in a very poor country and other players, which include 2 UN agencies, 2 non-governmental organizations, a commercial bank. So all of these people from this community are going to be playing these roles, which they will read up on in the hour or so before they participate, and then we'll do the simulations. But at the same time, we'll have very interactive teaching and take them through all of the building blocks to negotiation, which include decision-making, persuasion, understanding the psychological traps that people fall into that make them produce less than optimal outcomes of negotiations.
And we hope and anticipate that this will be a recurring opportunity so that people watching today who have not had a chance to participate in the current workshop will have that opportunity later on.
Well, I hope so, because actually one of the things that I hope the people will take away from the program is that they will become better negotiators, and our record in the program in Oxford is we get phenomenal feedback from people. One of them working for a large aircraft manufacturer, there aren't too many in the world anymore, told me that since he'd done the program he'd sold 39 wide-bodied aircraft in the subsequent 3 years. Now you've got to see, well, did he get value for money from the program? He said, I can't guarantee that to people here, but what I can guarantee is they'll have a lot of fun. and it will open their eyes to the way they behave. I'm not a behavioral or cognitive psychologist myself, but people teaching the program are, and I've drawn quite heavily on that sort of research, and I think people discover things about themselves which are really quite illuminating and do make them better negotiators.
Now, you've of course have been involved with global negotiations for many, many years, having spent a good part of your career at the World Bank. Tell us a little bit about that World Bank experience and how it relates to your work today.
Well, in several ways. I mean, one thing, I was at the World Bank for 21 years. I was the chief spokesman of the World Bank, so actually some of the negotiations I engaged in there were with certain newspapers and their editors and so on, about who maybe had treated us unfairly, we felt, and in my position, the danger was that if we negotiated with a newspaper that we thought was rather gunning for us, that if we came out as being wounded and bitter, it wouldn't do any good. And so at the heart of any negotiation is putting yourself in the other person's shoes. And so even though I was being paid by the World Bank, I always had to realize that if one guy who I particularly remember on the Wall Street Journal, who rather had it in for us, it was a dialogue. We had a very good dialogue, a very friendly dialogue. Whenever I run into him nowadays, it's very friendly. I knew exactly what his issues were, where his concerns were, and so we tried to respond to those things without being unduly defensive. And that was at one level of negotiation. And the other level, I was deeply involved in the reconstruction of Bosnia. The biggest negotiation there by the time I became involved, which was after the Dayton Peace Accords, was actually between the people trying to rebuild the economic side of Bosnia with the High Representative's Office, which was trying to ensure that the political settlement stayed in place. And so there was a bit of a conflict there between the World Bank, who had the attitude, if we can prove to people in Bosnia that there is an alternative to war, and it is better to stop fighting and take advantage of economic aid, that's going to be it'll prevent war in the future. But the High Representative's Office said, we want to use the aid as a carrot, a stick and carrot, to try to get the Republika Srpska group to comply with Dayton. So there are these different sorts of negotiations which I was exposed to there, and got me very interested in the subject.
So obviously in the course of your career you've had a chance to travel all over the world. What would be a couple of the most memorable places you visited, and maybe tell us a little bit about the circumstances of those trips?
Well, probably recently the most interesting place was being invited to teach the United Nations country team, the officials from the UN based in North Korea, in Pyongyang. And I was invited over there to teach them how to negotiate. And I spent the best part of a week in North Korea, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I always think that when places are called democratic and peoples, the least interest they have is in democracy or the people that live in those countries, but that's what tends to happen with those countries. But a very peculiar place. I felt very privileged to have the chance to go there. Nothing quite prepares you for it. It's a very, 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 very controlled society. In fact, when I left North Korea and flew back to Beijing, I had this great sense of contrast that I was flying into one of the most liberal and countries with the greatest freedom of expression you could imagine when I returned to China after that visit. And I'm a big fan of China actually, but it isn't you wouldn't normally describe it that way. But North Korea is a very interesting experience. What was most rewarding about it was that in the end, because we had a number of North Koreans who work for the UN, most of them were expats, the people I was teaching, but the people who work for the UN there, they started out very cautiously and not very engaging, and by the end of the two-day negotiation program, which is somewhat similar to the one we'll be doing here, they were all laughing and enjoying the program. They all wanted to have to be photographed with me at the end, and they were laughing with their international colleagues, and they said, the international group said, this had never happened before. So I think a program like this is a great sort of networking and relaxing sort of experience. There were some odd moments. They came up to me at one point because the role play referred to an initial public offering, and I simply put an IPO they came up to me and said, what is an IPO? This is completely outside their sphere of knowledge. They live a very, very different life than we live. And I felt, I sympathize with the people, because the regime is really pretty extraordinary, but the people are, good human beings when you can sort of scratch through the veneer which they have to present to the outside world. Very interesting experience there. They confiscate your mobile phone when you arrive, and put it in a little bag and give it back to you when you leave. And but funnily enough, they let me take photographs. Never any restrictions on taking photographs. Admittedly, I didn't try to take the wrong sort of photographs.
So if you needed to communicate with somebody outside the country during your stay, how did you do that? It was through monitored...
Well, I did pick up the hotel phone, which of course I knew somebody was listening to it. And I talked to my wife for 3 minutes, and that cost $37. So it's not easy. But funnily enough, at breakfast in my hotel the first morning, I ran into a guy wearing a St. Anthony's College, Oxford, which is actually this coat of arms, sweatshirt. And I said, well, what are you doing here? And he was an American working on decommissioning the nuclear sites. And he kept on referring to people from the dark side who he'd worked with over the years. And he was on a State Department contract to do this. And he was somebody very familiar with that sort of strange world of the Cold War extended, as it were. And he brought me to his room in the hotel, where he had the internet set up and so on. So he'd done some deal with the hotel and the government that allowed him to have the internet. And his room was almost converted into a quite livable sort of place with his computer set up and everything. And he's got his music, and there's a way of making life there bearable.
Yes, if you're going to be there for the longer term rather than just for a week. Now, you talked about China, and you've obviously had tremendous experience in large countries, but your interests also take you to small countries. Let's talk a little bit about those places, especially given the economic turmoil we've been through in the past couple of years. We tend to focus on the more prominent players and how the global recession has affected them. We don't think so much about the smaller countries, which perhaps are affected much more.
Well, absolutely, and I think it's in a way there's a little bit of a metaphor in the way the financial crisis is affecting people in the large countries, that a lot of attention is paid to quite wealthy people and their losses and so on, and yet we are aware that a lot of poor people really suffer a lot from the fallout. And in a way that's a bit of a metaphor on a global scale, because we do, as you say, pay attention to the rich countries, or the big countries, but there are more than 40 countries in the world that have populations of less than 1.5 million. They're very, very small countries. I happen to come from a small country that's very prosperous. I'm British, but I'm actually from the Isle of Man, very small country, middle of the Irish Sea. It's a crown dependency. It has the oldest parliament in the world. It's very well run. It's a financial centre which is extremely well regulated. It's also at the top of the OECD's lists of cooperative centres from a tax standpoint. It has completely free transmit of information. It exchanges information on tax issues freely and so on. So it's a very good, reputable place. I felt that the Isle of Man had something that it could share with other small states. And so over the last couple of years, I've been working on an initiative which is actually seeing the light of day in a few weeks' time, which is, very broadly speaking, it's going to be an Oxford University program, financially supported by the government of the Isle of Man, but also supported by the World Bank, the IMF, a number of other governments. And what it's going to do is bring to the Isle of Man 30 officials from the finance sectors of small countries for a 2-week program of capacity building being taught by world-class professors and practitioners.
Now, under ordinary conditions, they would not have access to these individuals.
Exactly, that's the thing. I mean, the problems of the small states are that many of them are remote, particularly in the Pacific, but to some extent in the Caribbean as well, and in Africa. They have a very small population, so almost by definition, it's difficult to get really good people in these top positions. And when you think of a population of, say, the Marshall Islands, 35, 40,000, I mean, that's the size of a very small community in Florida. And you can imagine a small community in Florida having a fully fledged finance ministry, other ministries, and a financial regulator, and banks that are properly regulated, and so on. And it's a real challenge to get people that are sufficiently skilled to run those things. And then with the financial crisis, how do these small places cope? So that's why the global community has been so excited by this initiative. And I've been spending the last few days reviewing the applications of the more than 100 people who've applied to come on this 2-week program. And we're going to have 30 people from 30 different countries that are going to come for this program. And we hope that this is going to contribute to them being more resilient to be able to handle crises in the future.
I think it's also worth explaining how the portfolio differs from the portfolio that a minister would have in a larger country. We hosted some finance ministers recently from small countries, and often they had the finance minister portfolio and 3, 4, 5, 6 others. So your work is multiplied by many times, and the challenges relative to the size of the country are probably just as significant.
That's absolutely true. I mean, in a way, we're quite lucky in the Isle of Man. We have a population of 81,000. We have a parliament with 21 members, and we have almost half of those are ministers. Anywhere else, they would really be town councillors. I mean, it's not. But they rise to the occasion marvelously, in my view. Most of the time, they really perform as ministers, and our Treasury Minister is extremely competent in dealing in international things. But the other thing that's very important is that the political figures are served by a really strong administration from a civil service point of view. And that's what we're really aiming to do, is to try to improve the capacity. So you do have people with similar job titles to their equivalent in London or Washington or New York. But the scope of what they're going to do is in some cases narrow, but in other cases much broader. Mm-hmm. And there are 2 real reasons why I was very keen to do this. One was that, to get this rolling, and one was that there are poor people living in these countries. There may be only 35,000 or 1.5 million of them in each of these countries, but they're people whose life is particularly hard because of the remoteness and so on. But also, so there's that moral imperative to work with them, but there's the other imperative that a number of these countries are points of vulnerability in the attempt to stop the illicit movement of money, drug money, terrorism money. So we're emphasizing anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism quite strongly in our program, because that's a global good to improve the curtailment of those activities. And we're also doing something I think quite interesting, and everybody who comes in this program will bring with them a particular challenge that they are going to have to address in the next few months. And I think the great value of it is they're going to be able to share their challenge with other people who may have similar challenges. So somebody in Vanuatu in the Pacific may discover that somebody in Dominica in the Caribbean has actually been through the same experience before. And so we're going to have very good professors and other faculty that are going to help guide these thoughts, and then they're going to be learning a lot from outstanding instructors throughout the 2 weeks. And it's more about changing the way they think about doing things, changing the culture, than it is about traditional training, which is just teaching them the actual techniques.
And presumably they would establish some kind of network so that they would routinely communicate, whereas under, again, ordinary conditions, you might not have somebody from the Pacific Islands communicating with his or her counterpart in the Caribbean.
There is the possibility, if we have sufficient funding, that we may be able to do interim programs in between, and we may do those on a regional basis or do them again in the Isle of Man. And we hope we can sponsor research, and because we've established a small countries financial management center, which I'm directing, and so there will be a sort of focus for this for the future.
What are some of the other projects you're working on?
I do things that are particularly interesting. I'm particularly interested in fostering a better dialogue, which is what negotiation's all about anyway, but on things like reforms in the water sector. I've done quite a lot in that area. So last year I was advising, or earlier this year I was advising the Mekong River Commission, which is a very interesting model for international relations in a river basin of the Mekong. Last year I was working with Mike Spence, Professor Michael Spence, the Nobel laureate, who was heading the Commission on Growth and Development, and that was a a very interesting experience. And interestingly, the Growth Commission, which consisted of a remarkable group of world leaders in the financial sector, or the economic sector, they came out with the growth report, which made recommendations of how countries that were not growing could learn from those countries that have grown very successfully in recent years. And there was a special chapter devoted to small states, as the particular challenges small states face. So these things all sort of tie in together quite nicely. But that was a very interesting experience, and very fulfilling to work with a great economist like Mike Spence, but also to be discussing with half a dozen finance ministers, 3 or 4 current or former prime ministers, some of the world's leading economists, including 2 Nobel laureates and people like that, discussing with them and trying to help them actually come to a conclusion and try to get them all to agree on the messages that should go into this report, which is really one of my functions, was to come in really as a semi-outsider and help them to realize that their positions were not really that far apart. And that was a wonderfully fulfilling experience, a quite heady experience of dealing with people like that, of that stature. And then after the report came out, I went with Mike Spence. We launched it in London, and then he and I went to Beijing together and met the People's Bank of China leadership and so on, and discussed the conclusions. Of course, China was one of the star performers in terms of growth.
Speaking of Nobel laureates, I was in a conversation with Desmond Tutu just a few days ago, and he was talking about the global economy and how that points to the interconnectedness of today's world and climate change as well. He said essentially, in his opinion, we're all family, and these situations help underscore that reality. But as you look to the future, assuming that we get beyond the recession, which we will, what are the other issues that are high on your list of priorities, things that you think need to be addressed that perhaps haven't received enough attention?
Yeah, I think that it comes back to what one of my sort of my life work has been really is in development, and I think that the programs that you run here have really helped to sensitize people in Western countries to the challenges in developing countries. And I think that I would say economic growth is absolutely critical. And I mean, I was working with the Growth Commission, and the reason I did was because I've always been a very strong believer in equitable growth. There are people out there who will tell you that growth is a bad thing, that growth is uneven and that sort of thing. But if growth is uneven, but it still lifts people out of poverty, it's better to have the growth than no growth at all. And I feel that not enough people appreciate the fact that you cannot lift people out of poverty in the absence of growth. You will never improve the lives of the poorest people in the world unless you have growth, but you've got to have the right sort of growth. Growth that is equitable, growth that benefits from international interactions, countries that close themselves off from the world, whether politically like North Korea, or until 10 years ago, India economically closed itself off, or 15 years, closed itself off from the world. When it started to open up, it did really well, and it did much better. The same with China. 30 years ago, China embarked on an open policy to the world economically, and look at the results. And so I think openness to the world and addressing growth issues as equitably as possible, but if what they call the Gini coefficients, the difference between the rich and the poor in a country, ends up widening, that's something you should try to address. But actually, if everybody is having a better quality of life and everybody's being lifted, even if some people are being lifted faster than others, it's still worth doing.
Good. Well, on that note, we'll conclude. Thank you, Professor Cullen, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, John.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Garcia, and we'll see you next time.